Montana Territory, late autumn, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself with drama. It settles in early stays late and works its way into everything. Wood shrinks, doors stop closing right. Breath hangs in the air long after a man exhales. Out here, winter doesn't need a storm to be deadly. It only needs time. Most frontier deaths didn't happen during blizzards. They happened weeks later, when the fire burned low at 3 a.m, when a man was too tired to split more wood, when a child's cough lasted too long. Cold weakened people first. Then it finished the job. Cabins across the valley prepared the same way every year. More firewood, thicker chinking, extra blankets, bigger fires. Men believed warmth was something you fought for, hour by hour, log by log. If a cabin stayed cold, the answer was always the same burn, more wood. But one man didn't follow that rule. While his neighbors stacked cord after cord against their walls, he spent his time doing something that looked useless. He worked on his cabin walls, not adding more logs, not sealing gaps. He changed how the walls interacted with the ground itself. People laughed, quietly at first, then openly. They said walls weren't the problem. They said heat came from fire, not dirt. They said you didn't fix winter by piling earth where wood should breathe. They said it was a stupid idea. By January, when the temperature dropped deep into the negatives and stayed there, those same men noticed something strange. His cabin didn't smoke like theirs. He wasn't cutting wood every spare hour. He didn't look worn down. His children weren't sick. And the most unsettling part wasn't that his cabin was warmer. It was how much warmer, nearly 30 degrees warmer than cabins built the same way, using the same materials, burning the same wood. No new stove, no miracle fuel, just a different understanding of what cold really is and how to stop it. This story isn't about luck. It isn't about toughness. And it isn't about outworking winter. It's about a simple idea. Most people ignored an idea learned the hard way on the frontier. Cold doesn't need to be fought. It needs to be blocked, slowed, and denied access. And the man everyone laughed at understood that before the first hard freeze ever arrived. Frontier cabins were not badly built. Most of them were built exactly the way generations before had taught. Log walls notched tight, chinking packed with clay and moss, stone chimneys set heavy and square. On paper they were solid. By frontier standards they were respectable. But winter exposed a problem nobody liked to admit. These cabins leaked heat from every direction at once. Logs shrank as temperatures dropped, opening hairline gaps you couldn't see until wind found them. Floors sat above frozen ground, pulling cold upward all night long. Corners stayed cold no matter how hard the fire burned. Heat rose fast, escaped through thin roofs, and vanished into the dark. So men compensated the only way they knew how. Bigger fires, more wood, longer nights awake feeding the stove. A typical winter routine looked like this: wake up every 3 or 4 hours, pull on frozen boots, break ice in the water bucket, add wood, wait for the fire to catch, then crawl back under blankets that never fully warmed. By morning, the cabin might still be under 40 degrees. The fire was never winning. It was only slowing the loss. Wood became the currency of survival. Men judged winter readiness by how high their wood piles stood. Families measured comfort by how close they could sit to the stove. Children slept in layers of wool, often coughing by February. Women heated stones, wrapped them in cloth, and tucked them into beds, knowing they'd be cold again before dawn. Nobody questioned the system because it was the only one they knew. Cold, they believed, came from the air. So they fought the air. What they missed was what the ground was doing beneath their feet. The earth below those cabins didn't freeze the way the air did. Just a few feet down, temperatures stayed steady all winter long. Not warm, but stable, predictable, calm. Most settlers never thought about that. Their lives happened above ground. Their instincts told them dirt meant damp, rot, and danger, so they raised their homes higher, farther from it. The man with the stupid wall idea made the opposite choice. He didn't try to overpower winter. He asked why the ground never seemed to lose. The man didn't stand out in the valley. That was part of the reason people overlooked him. He wasn't loud. He didn't argue at the supply store. He didn't give advice unless asked. He worked his land, fixed what broke, and kept his opinions mostly to himself. He had lived on the frontier long enough to know that drawing attention rarely ended well. Before he settled there, he had spent years in places most men tried to forget, below ground. Not tunnels for shelter, but tunnels for work. Dark, narrow spaces where daylight never reached and seasons barely mattered. Down there, the world stayed the same, no matter what the weather did above. He noticed things other men didn't bother naming. How stone walls felt the same in July and January. How the air never froze. How you could work all day underground without sweating or shivering. The earth held its temperature. It always had. Most men saw that work as something to endure until they could escape it. He treated it like an education. When he finally built his cabin, he built it the same way everyone else did. Logs, stone chimney, raised floor. It worked well enough. But every winter brought the same frustration. Too much wood burned for too little warmth. Too many hours lost feeding fires. Too many nights listening to wind press against the walls. He didn't complain. He watched. By the time he started changing his cabin, he wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't chasing comfort. He was trying to remove a weakness. That's what most people missed. They thought he was experimenting. He wasn't. He was correcting a mistake he now understood. When neighbors noticed what he was doing, they assumed he'd gone soft, packing earth near his walls, reinforcing certain sides more than others, changing airflow instead of adding fuel. It looked backward, primitive, wrong. Someone joked that he was trying to live like a badger. He didn't explain himself. Experience had taught him that explanations didn't matter until results showed up. He wasn't building a better fire. He was building a cabin that didn't need to fight winter in the first place. And by the time the valley realized that difference mattered, the cold had already settled in for good. Most people on the frontier understood weather. They watched the sky, read the wind, judged the cold by how fast water froze in a bucket. But very few understood the ground beneath them. They treated earth as an enemy. Dirt meant damp. Damp meant rot. Rot meant failure. So cabins were lifted away from it, floors raised, walls kept dry and exposed. The goal was separation. That instinct made sense until winter arrived. What most settlers never learned was this air changes fast. Earth does not. Just a few feet below the surface, the ground stays steady all year long. Not warm, not cold, steady, while the air above swings wildly from summer heat to winter extremes. The earth moves slowly, holding onto yesterday's warmth and refusing tomorrow's cold. Men who worked underground knew this without naming it. Miners, tunnel crews, well diggers. They didn't talk about thermal mass or ground temperature stability. They just knew that deep enough winter stopped mattering. The man with the wall idea had lived inside that truth for years. Down below the surface, stone didn't steal heat from your hands. Walls didn't freeze your breath. The earth absorbed temperature and gave it back slowly. That stability wasn't magic, it was physics doing exactly what it always does. Above-ground cabins fought the air, Fires blasted heat upward straight into thin roofs and leaky corners. Every degree of warmth had to be constantly replaced. Below ground, or buffered by it, the rules changed. Heat stopped escaping so fast. Cold stopped rushing in. The fight turned into balance instead of exhaustion. This wasn't new knowledge. Ancient shelters had used it. Root cellars used it. Animals used it every winter without thinking. What was new was how completely settlers ignored it. Once log sawmills and stoves became common, the man didn't try to bury his cabin. He did something simpler. He brought the ground back into the conversation. Instead of keeping earth away from his walls, he used it. He let soil, stone, and mass slow winter down before it ever reached the interior. And that single shift, working with the earth instead of against it, changed everything that came after. He didn't dig a bunker. He didn't move underground. And he didn't rebuild his cabin from scratch. What he did was far less dramatic, and that's why people dismissed it. He changed the way his walls met the earth. On the north and west sides of the cabin, the sides that took the full force of winter wind, he built them up. Slowly, carefully, he packed earth against the exterior wall, not loose dirt but layered soil mixed with stone and clay. He sloped it slightly outward so water would run away instead of in. At the base, he laid gravel for drainage. Nothing fancy, just deliberate. To anyone watching, it looked wrong. Cabin walls were supposed to stay exposed. Wood needed to breathe. Everyone knew that. Packing dirt against logs was how you caused rot. That was the common wisdom, repeated so often it stopped being questioned. But he wasn't careless. He left a small air gap between the log wall and the packed earth. He focused on drainage first, not insulation. Dry ground, not wet soil, was the key. The earth never touched the wood directly. What he created was a buffer. Wind hit the earth before it hit the wall. Cold slowed down before it reached the logs. The wall stopped being the first line of defense and became the second. From the inside, nothing looked different. Same stove, same logs, same floor. But the cabin stopped bleeding heat through those walls. The cold no longer had a straight path inside. People called it stupid because it didn't look like progress. No new tool, no iron, no machinery, just dirt and patience. They laughed because it reminded them of older shelters, older ways, things they believed they'd moved past. What they didn't see was that he wasn't going backward. He was stripping the problem down to its basics. Cold moves fast through air, slow through earth. Walls fail when they're forced to fight both at once. His wall trick didn't create heat. It denied cold. And that difference mattered more than any fire he could build. There was no mystery behind the wall trick, no luck, no secret material. It worked because it followed rules the frontier usually ignored. Cold moves fast through air. Wind strips heat away the moment it finds a surface. That's what winter does best. It doesn't need to break walls. It only needs access. Earth is different. Soil, stone, and clay don't change temperature quickly. They absorb heat slowly and give it back just as slowly. That delay is everything. By backing his walls with earth, the man changed the speed of heat loss. Wind no longer struck the logs directly. The earth took the hit first. By the time cold reached the wall, it had already been slowed, weakened, dulled. Inside the cabin, heat stopped rushing outward. The stove didn't have to overpower freezing air anymore. It only had to raise the temperature a little above the ground's steady baseline. That's why the difference was so dramatic. Most cabins in that valley struggled to stay above 40 degrees on the coldest nights. Even with a fire burning, the heat vanished the moment the flames dipped. Floors stayed icy. Corners stayed dead cold. His cabin didn't behave that way. The walls held warmth. The floor stopped pulling heat downward. The interior temperature stayed even, not hot, but stable, predictable, comfortable. He still burned wood, just far less of it. Instead of fighting to gain 60 degrees against the cold, he only needed 10 or 15. The ground handled the rest. People assumed warmth came from strength, bigger fires, more fuel, more effort. What they missed was efficiency. A wall that slows heat loss is more powerful than any stove. A structure that holds temperature doesn't need constant attention. It frees time energy, and sleep things winter usually steals first. That was the quiet advantage. While other men fed fires all night, he slept. While others ran out of wood by February, his pile lasted. The wall didn't make his cabin luxurious. It made it survivable, and on the frontier that difference decided who made it through winter and who didn't. The real test came when winter stopped teasing and committed fully. By mid-December, the temperature dropped hard and stayed there. Nights fell well below zero. Days barely climbed back. Snow wasn't the worst of it. Wind was. It pushed down from the high country without pause, probing every seam in every structure, like it knew exactly where weakness lived. That's when the valley began to break. Chimneys stopped drawing properly. Smoke backed into cabins. Men climbed onto roofs in dangerous cold to clear ice and creosote. Firewood that had seemed plentiful in October vanished by Christmas. Families started closing off rooms they couldn't afford to heat. Children slept in coats. Women worked with numb fingers. Everyone was tired. The man with the stupid wall trick didn't change his routine. He lit the stove in the morning. He let it burn low at night. He slept through until daylight. His cabin stayed steady, not warm like summer, but warm enough that breath didn't fog the air, warm enough that water didn't freeze by the bed, warm enough that his children stayed healthy. That's when people started noticing, not all at once. Quietly, someone realized his chimney didn't smoke all night. Someone else noticed he wasn't hauling wood every spare hour. Someone pointed out that his children were still playing outside when others were kept indoors. By January, it was impossible to ignore. The difference wasn't 5 degrees, or 10. On the coldest nights, his cabin stayed nearly 30 degrees warmer than others built the same way on the same land using the same wood. No miracle, no secret stove, just walls that refused to give winter a straight path inside. The laughter stopped when the cold wouldn't, because on the frontier results speak louder than tradition, and winter had made its choice clear. The shift didn't happen all at once. Pride doesn't break quickly, especially on the frontier. Men held on to old habits longer than they should have. They always did. But winter has a way of stripping pride down to essentials. It started with questions that sounded casual. How much wood are you burning? How often do you stoke the fire at night? You keeping the stove going all day, he answered honestly. Less than last year, once before bed. Sometimes not at all, until morning. That didn't sit right with people. A few men asked to step inside. Not officially, just to warm their hands. They stood near the walls, then near the floor. They noticed the temperature didn't drop off in the corners. They noticed there was no sharp cold pulling at their boots. Someone brought a thermometer, then another. The numbers were hard to argue with. When word spread, the jokes stopped. The laughter turned into silence. Silence turned into interest. Interest turned into something closer to respect. Men who had sworn dirt against walls was foolish began asking how he handled moisture. Men who warned about rot wanted to know about drainage. Men who said the ground was dangerous started asking how deep the frost actually went. He didn't lecture, he showed. He pointed to the gravel at the base, the slope away from the logs, the air gap that kept wood dry, the way the earth sat firm, not wet, not frozen. He didn't claim it was perfect, he said it was better. That mattered. By late January, a few cabins in the valley started to change. Small changes at first. Earth piled higher on windward sides. Stone added where dirt wasn't available. Floors insulated instead of ignored. Not everyone copied him. Some couldn't, some wouldn't. But the idea had broken loose. Winter hadn't changed. The cold was just as brutal. What changed was how people thought about it. They stopped asking how to make bigger fires. They started asking how to keep the heat they already had. And that question marked the real turning point, not just for one cabin, but for an entire valley learning something its ancestors once knew and had slowly forgotten. The wall wasn't the lesson, the thinking behind it was. Frontier survival was never about brute force. It wasn't about proving how much cold a man could endure or how many cords of wood he could burn. That kind of thinking wore people down long before winter ended. The people who lasted learned something simpler. They stopped fighting nature head-on. They watched animals, burrowing, using earth as cover, letting mass and depth do the work. They built root cellars that stayed usable all year, dug into hillsides for storage without ever calling it science. Somewhere along the way, that knowledge faded. Stoves got better, sawmills got closer, fuel felt cheaper, people trusted tools more than understanding. The man with the wall trick didn't reject progress, he just didn't depend on it. He understood that the most reliable systems don't need constant attention. They don't wake you up at night. They don't collapse the moment you miss a step. They work quietly, even when you're exhausted. That's what his walls did. They didn't make his cabin impressive, they made it dependable. On the frontier that mattered more than pride. It meant fewer sick children, fewer accidents in the dark, fewer mistakes made by men too tired to think clearly. People remembered the warmth, but the real value was stability. That lesson applies far beyond log cabins. Any shelter that loses heat faster than you can replace it will eventually fail. Any system that requires non-stop effort will break when effort runs out. The old frontier wisdom wasn't about hardship for its own sake. It was about designing life so hardship didn't win by default. The wall trick looked foolish because it didn't look strong. But strength on the frontier was never about force. It was about choosing battles you could actually win. And the man everyone laughed at chose the only one that mattered, slowing winter down before it ever crossed the wall. What that mountain man figured out wasn't tied to his time. It wasn't limited to log cabins, wood stoves, or the 19th century. The principle outlived all of that. He learned that the cheapest heat is the heat you don't lose. Modern people tend to think comfort comes from equipment. Bigger furnaces, stronger heaters, better fuel. When energy gets expensive or systems fail, the first instinct is to upgrade the machine. Frontier thinking went the other direction. Instead of asking how to make more heat, he asked how to keep what he already had. That question still matters, especially now. Off-grid homes, remote cabins, even modern houses in cold regions all face the same problem his cabin faced. Heat loss, drafts, surfaces exposed directly to wind and temperature swings. When those weaknesses exist, no heater is ever enough. That's why many modern builders quietly return to the same ideas. Earth-bermed walls, insulated slabs, thermal mass built into floors and walls, passive heating instead of constant input. The names changed, the physics didn't. What made the wall trick powerful wasn't that it was extreme, it was restrained. It didn't demand constant effort. It didn't rely on perfect conditions. It worked while people slept. That kind of reliability is rare. It also explains why the idea still makes people uncomfortable. It asks for patience instead of force, planning instead of reaction, understanding instead of habit. The mountain man didn't need electricity. He didn't need new technology. He didn't need to burn through resources faster than his neighbors. He used what was already there. Earth, mass, time. Today, when energy costs rise and systems fail unexpectedly, the same lesson applies. Any shelter that depends entirely on active heating is fragile. Any structure that works with natural stability gains an advantage that doesn't disappear when fuel runs low. That's not nostalgia, it's practical. The frontier didn't reward people who looked modern. It rewarded people who understood fundamentals. And fundamentals never go out of date. The mountain man never claimed he'd discovered anything new. When people finally stopped by to ask questions, he didn't talk like a teacher. He talked like someone explaining a fence repair or a water line. Simple, direct, practical. This works because it slows the cold down. This stays dry because water runs away from it. This holds heat because mass always does. That was it. He didn't try to convert the whole valley. Some people copied him. Some didn't. That was always how it went. Frontier life left little room for arguments that didn't produce results. What mattered was that the idea existed again. Long after that winter passed, people remembered the season for how hard it had been. They remembered failed chimneys, empty woodpiles, sick children. But a few also remembered the cabin that stayed steady when everything else struggled. Not because it was stronger, because it was smarter. The frontier rewarded quiet solutions, the kind that didn't announce themselves, the kind that didn't need defending, the kind that worked whether anyone believed in them or not. That's the lesson people tend to miss when they romanticize the past. Survival wasn't about suffering. It was about reducing risk until life became manageable again. That wall trick didn't make winter disappear. It made winter smaller, and that difference mattered more than any story of endurance. Because in the end, the goal was never to prove toughness. It was to last. That's what frontier wisdom really was. Not pride, not tradition for its own sake, just clear thinking applied where it mattered most. And it's still there for anyone willing to look past noise, past habit, and past laughter, back to the fundamentals that kept people alive when failure meant more than inconvenience. Winter hasn't changed, but the way you meet it still can.